For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, and all the proud, yes, all who do wickedly, will be stubble. And the day which is coming shall burn them up, says the Lord of hosts, that will leave them neither root nor branch. But to you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. I love that verse. Okay, so I want to make some comments about John 6:44, which has been a popular thing in discussion lately. And one thing that I've learned, I feel that's a good way of looking at things from a layman's point of view as best I can, is to, when approaching a text, when having dialogue with people that disagree, is to look at the text like exegetically, or like looking at what the words mean, and to begin with, isolating the text and discussing the potential possibilities of what the words can mean by themselves, isolated from context, and then go from there. What do these words allow all by themselves as concepts, and understand what different people are saying and start from there. And then admit what is possible about this verse by itself with no context, the words, what could they mean? And then work your way out from there, acknowledging at least that much to start with, so you're not talking past each other. So there's been Leighton Flowers versus James White on John 6:44, which I think, and again, I'm going to start by saying this. The reason Leighton Flowers won for sure was pointed out in Leighton's opening few moments. It's not because James White is dumb. It's not because John 6:44 is impossible to be a Calvinist in John. No, none of that is the case. It's because the burden of proof for James White to win the debate was to show that John 6:44 teaches Calvinist distinctives. I forget which one it was. Maybe it's either total depravity. They're all connected, so it doesn't really matter. But it was. I don't think it was total depravity. I think it was irresistible grace. I think. I don't remember though for sure. But my point is, John 6:44, in and of itself, for one, does not demand, in the way I described. Let's start with that. Does not teach or demand that we take those Calvinist distinctives. It certainly is compatible with the Calvinist reading of tulip, total depravity. Like it's certainly true that no one can come to me unless the Father draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. That certainly is compatible with total depravity and limited atonement and and unconditional election and all that, and perseverance of the saints. Because it's like, this, what they believe is that every person, every human is born incapable of coming to the Son unless the Father does this work of opening their mind, enabling them to come. Okay, that's total depravity. And unconditional election, limited atonement, and irresistible grace means because the ones that he makes come to the Son by enabling them to come will come, because it says those ones, whether you think that raising him up on the last day is the one who comes or the one who's enabled. I think it's a dumb distinction. They're the same one. So it's referring to either, both. It doesn't matter. The one coming is the one drawn. It's effectual in that sense, in its usage here. That's what it says. Now, and so it's the ones he chooses, and they irresistibly come, and they will be raised up on the last day. It's a statement of fact. And even within that sentence itself, the ones who come are the ones who are drawn, and the ones who are drawn are the ones who have been made, who are enabled, like in the construction of the sentence, right? It sounds like tulip, all a tulip almost, you could argue. But for some reason, not everybody would argue that, but many people who aren't Calvinists or who do not hold to 5 points of Calvinism, which is all of those 5 points, if they're raised up on the last day, then they also persevere. And they're drawn irresistibly because the ones who are enabled are the ones who come, and the ones who come will be raised up on the last day. So that means they persevered unto glorification. So really, it kind of seems like all of tulip is demanded by this text. And that's why I say it certainly is compatible with tulip. The question is, does it demand it? Were all the points of tulip meant to be the author's intention of this text to be teaching those things? That's the question. And the answer to that by the honest person, if they're open-minded of how language works and how context determines theological interpretation, the context, immediate and greater, and moving out from there. But if you can't admit that the language doesn't demand those philosophical concepts or theological concepts in that sentence alone, okay, it just shows you're not thinking clearly. And then people are going to say, no, I'm not thinking clearly, I'm just in denial. No, I think it kind of sounds like your view, probably because I've been brainwashed by listening to you who assert that. But the fact of the matter is, context has to give us because we got to ultimately go by what the author's intention was. And that is way overboard to say that's what's being demanded. Why is that? I'll make a case for that. Again, the reason Leighton Flowers couldn't lose the debate, because he recognizes that that Calvinist exegesis can, which is what I basically just described. I actually take that sort of exegesis of the text of that. It's true that no one comes to Jesus in this in this statement here in John 6:44. It does say the only ones that came to Jesus, or that are coming to Jesus. He's giving a sermon, okay? It's a narrative. So we have to examine the context. This isn't like John is telling us a teaching Jesus made about the whole world and the condition of humanity. And he doesn't no, this is in a setting that sits in a moment in time at a certain point in Jesus' ministry, after he starts his ministry. And there's an audience that's being described in the context, and an issue that's being described that has a greater context back into the Old Testament. But if you focus in, because here's the issue for us, it's written, it's for us but not to us, right? And people are going to apply that principle in different ways. But to say every statement of Jesus in every context is a universal statement about to every human in a sort of philosophical way is a mistake. It could mean that. It might mean that. It's certainly we certainly should take Jesus' teachings as for us, but that comes after we look at the context of the original audience, so we get exactly. So we're not misapplying how it should apply to us. It's through the original context to the original audience that we can carefully derive its application to us. And that's the question on whether or not this is teaching about a condition of all humans, because we all probably would agree or say something like anyone who comes to Jesus for salvation, that is the work of God, right? But that means different things to different people. No, I mean, that's kind of a straw man that people who believe in total depravity would say towards people who don't accept it. And oh, you think you're saving yourself. Oh, you think you're a Pelagian. Maybe I'm a Pelagian. Maybe you're maybe depends on what you mean, I guess, right? I don't take that title. I think depends on what you mean by Pelagian. You mean the real Pelagian, the real Pelagius and what he believed? Or do you mean probably what Pelagius believed, that most people agree Pelagius actually believed? Or are you talking about the straw man version that people have in their heads? Or what somewhat of a majority of scholars would say Pelagius actually taught? Or do you mean the Pelagius that scholars think Pelagius didn't really teach, but kind of accept as the thing that Augustine is arguing against? Pelagius, that Pelagius. So which Pelagius are you accusing me of being? The real one, the hypothetical real one, the minority, the majority view, or the one that is just kind of presumed from the writings of Augustine? Which one? Be specific. I'm saying I don't think this is projecting a condition of total depravity on every human being being described by Jesus. It's in context where Jesus is explaining a condition at a certain point in his ministry early on, amongst that the context where some of these people are coming to him for the wrong reasons, and he's in the middle of demonstrating who he is and what he's come to do. And I do have commitments, philosophical commitments, to the idea that God does actually want people who aren't believing to believe, and he wants them to, but they resist it. And your presumption is that that's not the case. And at the end of the day, I'm advocating for the view that you're wrong about that. God does have intention to want to save people, and he desires them to repent and believe in Jesus. But at this point, but I still agree with the Calvinist exegesis, which we can look at. But first I want to show, I'm listening to Dan Chapa and Turretin fan. And Dan, of course, isn't advocating for the Calvinist point of view, but he is advocating that this verse is suggesting total depravity, and therefore he tends to want to argue with the Calvinists that the inability is universal being taught here. It's not so hyper-focused on the specific audience in the context. It's more, because I want to be honest, I don't disagree that there's an application here for all humans and about coming to Jesus for salvation. It's just a question of how constrained do you make the context? What are you demanding of the context as to be applied to the condition of all humanity rather than to a specific audience in a particular point in time in Jesus' ministry? I don't think people talk about this part enough. Because my desire is to just say this. I don't think this verse or this discourse in John 6 disproves Calvinism. It doesn't, but it doesn't demand it. That's the point. That's what the point I want to get across. And thinking it demands it is I think is to not be honest. I think the honest position would be, I think it strongly suggests that's the case, that's total depravity is true, but you can't say it demands it. The context doesn't, there's nothing that sets that context to demand that. And there's other reasons you can argue why that's not the case, but because I tend to agree with the Calvinists. So it is saying it's effectual in the sense that the ones that come to Jesus are only coming because they're drawn by the Father. I would just say this. Well, actually, no, let me, I think Dan says it really well. I want to play this clip.
This might dovetail into some of the provisionist objections nicely. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it does. So there are some of you that do not believe in 64. Now, the phrase Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not and who that should betray him is an aside. In some translations have it in parenthesis or something like that. But whatever the case is, it's narrative. It's not it's narrative. It's not Jesus's words. So Jesus's words go, but there are some of you that believe not. Therefore I said unto you that no one can come to me except it is given to him for my Father. Okay, so this actually is pretty core to the debate. What's going on here? Is Jesus explaining why some don't believe? That explanation being, it's not given unto them of the Father. Or is Jesus explaining why he's not doing something else for them? Right? Some of you don't believe, let's say, are not Old Testament saints. Some of you aren't Old Testament saints, and that's why you're not becoming New Testament saints. Those are the two different ways of looking at it. And yeah, I think that second way is frankly very hard to justify, but I have seen it explained that way. There's the reason why people aren't drawn, the reason why they're not having something given to them is because they don't believe. But what is the result of not being drawn and not being given? That they don't believe. So the only way to make it work is to split belief into two objects. One is belief in the Father. The second is belief in the Son.
Okay, I think that's a good point. But you can kind of tell that Dan's coming at it kind of from his, well, like anybody would, from their perspective of kind of total depravity is the case. And so I think it's really hard for someone who believes in a really strong total depravity to kind of phrase it in the way he did, right? Because he's not exactly like a Calvinist, but he does agree that it's something like this, that basically all things being equal, the condition is that nobody could have the ability to like comprehend Jesus' teaching and make the decision to come to Jesus unless sort of like this is where the Arminian has this idea of prevenient grace. They just don't think it's only afforded, they think it enables someone to come usually, or it's the thing needed because the people are unable to come to God unless God does some sort of extra sort of, I say zapping, but that may be a bad way to represent somebody, but it's like God has to do this external work or sort of spiritual work. Depends on how you want to think about it. The Calvinist would say, yeah, because it's only given to the elect that were pre-chosen. Dan would say something like God gives a prevenient grace, which is a necessary thing to happen. But they're not going to necessarily want to make that, outside of the teaching of Jesus, right? But it depends on when you're arguing this with these different views with people that disagree, they're going to kind of describe it differently, wanting to try to be textual about it. It's not that they're Old Testament saints per se. And so it like really doesn't even matter what Jesus is teaching. No, Jesus is the means by which they see they're drawn by the Father, right? I think we're all going to agree on that. So they're saying basically like, well, I guess it's just if you're an Old Testament saint, you'll come to Jesus. So what Jesus teaches it's nothing really Jesus is doing then. And it's like, no one's saying that. I don't think anybody's saying that. I would say what it's really trying to say, because of the context of John 6, is that the only ones that at this point in Jesus' ministry who aren't resisting his claims are the ones that are being drawn by the Father. How? By seeing Jesus. When they know that, let's think about John 14. Jesus says the Jews want to go where I'm going, which is to the Father in the context. And Jesus says, right before he tells the disciples they can't come where he's leaving, which is to the Father's house, but he's preparing a place for them. He says, well, the Jews can't come where I'm going either. Well, why would the Jews? They don't even think he's the Messiah. He means like they want to get to the Father. But since if you don't know me, you don't have the Father, right? John reiterates this in other places in his writings, right? He who has the Son has the Father, etc. He very much, this is the unity here. So really, I'm sorry, again, the drawing of the Father, that provision of the Father is the fact that they see the Father in Jesus and they recognize who he is. And so it's 100% Jesus. What they see about Jesus and his teachings, that is the drawing of the Father. And the whole idea that the Old Testament saints are it's the ones that properly know God, that are able to see God, the Father, in Jesus. But it's the drawing of the Father isn't this external thing that's added to Jesus' teaching that enables them per se. It's just the fact of the matter that the ones being drawn to Jesus are the ones that see the unity. They see the Father's, which is the drawing, in Jesus' teachings, but it's 100% what Jesus is doing and what they're seeing in Jesus. That's just all. The thing about the drawing of the Father is just sort of the explanation, because he's emphasizing the unity of the two, which is what the Gnostics, the ones that don't think Jesus came in the flesh, the opposition that the Antichrist brings in his spirit of opposition of the little horn, who comes by the working of Satan. He comes in his own name. That's why see John 5 is what indicates the context here, that sets this context, so that informs this interpretation. Let me go. I'll show you what I mean. So my whole point here is that it's compatible with compatibilism or determinism or Calvinism or not. That's not the point of these texts. The important point in that was what John is saying, is the unity of Jesus and the Father. And that is obvious if you understand the lofty claims about Jesus in John's particular gospel. The divinity imbued in Christ is his focus in the greater context of all of John's writings. And when you look at what John emphasizes in Jesus' confrontations with those who don't receive him, which is, we'll look at that in a second, but that's what he's saying. The way you won't be deceived by the Antichrist, and because if you have the Son, you have the Father. And it's why he warns against those who think Jesus didn't come in the flesh, because those who think Jesus didn't come in the flesh disunify Jesus with the Father. They don't, but Jesus' teaching is that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So the ones who see the Father in Jesus are the ones early in his ministry that are Jews, that's the only way they're going to be coming to Jesus at this time and early in his ministry, is if they're able to be drawn by the Father, because they see the importance, which John is emphasizing in his style here, he's saying, look, that's how you know Jesus is the Christ. He's one with the Father. He's doing the will of the Father, which is to redeem people for the sins against the Father that they've committed, and see the love of the Father in Jesus, which is perfectly united. That's the point. He doesn't, dude. And I want to say to the Calvinists, just as a kind of a sort of tongue-in-cheek thing here, particularly CJ. Okay, let's say it's true that the proper understanding the author's intent was he wants us to think that Jesus picks favorites and it's limited atonement's true, and we ought to recognize that, or God isn't getting all the glory, and it might lead us astray. We might lose our salvation, apparently, I guess, if we're saved, if we don't agree with Calvinism, which seems like, well, if we can lose it, then we're not really saved because we never really had it. But if we are saved and we don't have to believe Calvinism, who cares then, right? That doesn't matter. It's either we're not saved or we could lose our salvation if we don't agree with this. Otherwise, I don't see what the point would be to make such a big deal about it. But if that's true, then okay. Are you saying we have to believe this to show that we're regenerate Christians? I don't think you'd say that, Calvinists, although some of you suggest that in what you say all the time, it seems to me, to be honest. Or you're worried we could lose our salvation, which would undermine your whole point of view. So I don't see why you're so obsessed with proving this. The reason people don't agree with it, ultimately, in a theological sense, is because it makes God the author of sin. We refuse to go there, okay? The reality is John doesn't care about all that. He's not even thinking about whether or not you think total depravity is true or not. It's not his point. His point is the importance of Jesus being unified with the Father, which is why the Trinity matters. You can believe in the Trinity all day long. It ain't going to save you. The danger here is disunifying the Father and the Son. And that's John's concern. Why do I say that? Let's look at it. I'm open to modifying my view. I just think it's a much better explanation than what everybody's going on about. But of course, I'm a heretic Adventist who thinks you have to keep the Sabbath to honor God. But that aside, I still think I can defend this view. Okay, look at how John 1 starts. I can see how a Calvinist would read this, by the way, too. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus' divinity is obviously right. Is that not? And why does that matter? Because Jesus is united with the Father. It's the things that are sins against the Father are sins against the Son. The sins which are declared sins and righteousness, which is the righteousness of God, is Jesus, because he doesn't sin. He comes and shows us the ways of God perfectly as intended, right? His ministry and teaching as a rabbi perfectly interprets the intention of God's law. And he comes to condemn sin in the flesh and give mercy to sinners and show them how to walk in the ways of God as image bearers. He's restoring us, right? So it's very important that we don't confuse Jesus having some other agenda other than that of the Father, because Jesus and the Father are one. Jesus was there with the Father. He is God, right? He was there in the beginning. So Jesus is creator, redeemer, and judge, and all that is based on the law and the character of the Old Testament God. And Jesus is in full harmony with them. That's what matters, okay? That's what matters here. Because Jesus is redeeming us from sin, which leads to death. And that sin is described by this one God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Okay, so if you mess that up, you can affirm the claim of the proposition, I believe in the Trinity, or I believe Jesus pre-existed, and it doesn't really matter. The reason the Gnostic spirit is the spirit of the Antichrist is because it disunifies the Father and the Son, and that's why John can speak to the error of those who left the faith and lost their salvation because they didn't remain in the truth, because they didn't believe Jesus came in the flesh. That mangles the incarnation, which is important because Jesus is redeeming the creation, which is an embodied physical creation, and the things I already mentioned. So it's not that the incarnation issues don't matter and the divinity of Christ doesn't matter, or the Trinity doesn't matter. All those things do matter. But what is the ultimate foundation reason? It's because of the unity and the mission of the Messiah. Not because God will burn you forever if you don't affirm the right proposition. And you might be confused about how to separate the divinity of Jesus with his Father, because Jesus seems to talk about his God being the Father, which I would argue is just him showing us how to relate to God as a human in his mission as our brother of humanity, in his redeeming of us of humanity, his image bearers, which he becomes one of, even though he still is fully God and always has been. Okay, but still, if people could be confused about that, not want to affirm the Trinity because they don't want to be the next nunce who thinks he's saved because he affirms the right propositions and he actually cares about what's important, and he's confused based on his circumstances and the light that he's had in his life. And you call that person, you tell those types of people they're going to hell because you're an idiot. I think they should believe what's right, which is those things I just mentioned. But to judge them for that, when you affirm the Trinity and you turn around and disunify the Father and Son in many different other ways, shame on you. You're in trouble. How do you determine who a brother is anyway? Okay, so also look at John 5. This is very clear. The ones who aren't receiving him as Messiah, what is their problem? This is right before John 6. And by the way, he who hears my word, that means follows his teaching. Doesn't mean Jesus' word is just really all we needed. Jesus said, just believe I exist and you're saved, or that I died for your sins, and that's all that matters. And otherwise, if you don't believe just that, you're going to hell and I'm going to burn you forever. No, it means hear his teaching. His ministry matters. His life and teachings matter. You have to follow Jesus. That's part of hearing his word and believing in him. Even though your works do not save you whatsoever. That ship sailed the moment you were guilty or culpable for your decisions you make. It's still righteousness and justification by faith, 100%. But it doesn't mean you therefore get to disregard. It doesn't matter if you disregard his teaching. You have to believe his teaching. You have to. Okay, so I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive. How can you believe who receive honor from one another and do not seek the honor that comes from the only God? I do not receive honor. I don't care about what people think who don't care about what God thinks. I care about what is the love of the God anyways? What is this love of God that they don't have in them? Believing Jesus died for their sins? What is the love of God that they don't have? That makes them, in what way do they care about what men think and not what God thinks? I'll let you decide for yourself. I would suggest going to Matthew 15 for one, and I would look up what the love of God is in the New Testament. They make doctrines of men that nullify the commandments of God, and Jesus declares them worshiping God in vain. It doesn't say you don't believe the right soteriological position, that you can't lose your salvation, or that God determines everything, and if you don't believe that, you're not giving God all the glory. No, that's not the love of God. The love of God is what? His commandments is the love of God. They make up doctrines and nullify God's commandments because they care what men think and not the honor that comes from God, like Jesus taught and demonstrated. Because Jesus and the Father are one. And he came to redeem the works of the devil and to magnify the law and to demonstrate how a person in the image of God walks out that as intended originally, which they have distorted and become hypocrites of. So the question is, do you want the honor that comes from the one true God? And do you care what he says and what he defines as love? Or do you care what men think and the majority in the mob says that you must think? That's the question. What are you willing to follow what God said, not what men make up and replace God's ways with? Even though the majority will say you're a heretic, not saved, in a cult. That's the question. Are you willing to be despised for the truth? Or do you care what men think?